What's up? Hey, Andrew Chen here. Welcome back to part 3, I believe, of the React tutorial. This is the thing that we're going to be building in this section. As you can see, it is the same exact thing that we built in the last section, but we did a little bit more, and I will show you guys the code. The code is all right here. Um, you will see the difference is that last time we rendered exactly, we just put in a lot of JSX. So we put this part directly here and rendered that. But this time we actually encapsulated that JSX code that represented a clock into a function and then rendered it. And down here we actually put it into a class and then render it. So the reason we do this is that React is all about reusability. So whenever you see a component that is, something in the app that probably need to be reused a couple of times, for example, maybe the rows in a list. That's not the best example, but that's one I can think of right now. Or maybe if you want multiple clocks, then you probably want to make a clock component or function so that you can just call this instead of having to call this every single time, right? It's just simplifying stuff. Um, so yeah, in this one I'll be showing you guys how to encapsulate them in two ways. One is encapsulating code in two ways. One is called the functional way, which is making a functional component, and then the second one is making a class components. Functional functions are usually smaller than class, but there is a few restrictions to it. So without saying much, I'm just gonna Control Z this code all the way to nothing, and then we can start from here. By the way, I already ran my application on my local host. If you forgot how to do that, you just do npm run start or start run. I think it's run start. Okay. Alright. So this function, by the way, is not a functional component at all. It's just a random function. Here's how we turn this thing into a functional component. Really easy. Function clock. And I'll show you guys why they're props in a second. Uh, did I mess up something here? Did I need another return statement? Wait a second. Let me just. Not sure why this isn't okay. Right. That right there is how we make a clock. And then I'll be talking about what is this props thing here in a second. Um, yeah, as you can see, the code are practically the same. And the way we can actually render that right here, this clock right here, is by doing this. So this right here works. But we're going to make this a little bit even easier. How are we going to make this easier? Well, in a normal React component, in clock, it makes, it is sort of reasonable to call to display this new date dot to local time string every time inside of a clock. But we can also pass them as like a property from the parent to the children in React. Now, I know the clock is not the best example because you can put this here perfectly fine instead of making it in kind of like the parent component. But some of the cases, in a lot of cases, you do have stuff that you want to pass from the parent stuff that only lies inside of the parent that you want to pass to children. In that case, using props will be very valuable. So let me just show you guys what is props with this example. Date equals to new date. And then instead of calling new date, we can just say props.date, or maybe I should just specify past date to make it even more more intuitive. I really like naming variables long. I think they really help people. Yeah. So here's the thing, right? When we do this thing right here, it looks kind of, you know, if you did HTML before, this definitely looks like an HTML attribute thing. But in JSX, it is a little bit different. When you do this, that is not a default HTML attribute. So for example, if you do like, um, I can't think of any on click. Well, actually, yeah, all of these will be, sorry, just ignore what I said because on click is actually not HTML anymore. That is actually JSX because the HTML one is on click, normal. Yeah, just ignore what I said in the last 5 seconds. But whenever you do this thing right here, you are giving this clock that you're about to render a property, and the way we receive that in the function in the component is by doing this. Props here. That means we're accepting a prop, and then if we go call the props.passDate, which is this right here, and then you know we can just get access to this right here. Right? So I'll do it again. Whenever we do in the more parent component place, we make a clock and then we give it an attribute called passDate equals new date, and then inside of the actual clock component, we can access it by letting it accept something called a props, and then later, you know, just now you have access to the props and you can just do whatever. This thing, the past date will belong to as one of the properties of props. Yeah. Now I'm sure this makes sense. Like you guys do it a few times, you definitely get it. So that right there is actually functional components. There is a lot of limitations, and I'll go over them in a second. But let's just make a class one now. So that right here, there is a functional component. It is swifter in code and easier to read. So let's make this clock function instead of because we're about to make a clock class. Extends React.components. And then we're gonna do render return. Wait, why is this render thing? Oh, it should be this, I think. Sorry. Wait, that's not right. Oh yeah, forgot the syntax, guys. Sorry about that. Gonna return this whole thing right here. This is not gonna work right now. Yeah, it doesn't know what is props. So for the moment, we're going to do instead of props.passDate, we're gonna do the original way of how we did it, which is Adam is lagging for a second. Okay, it's back. Which is new date dot to local time string. And the way we actually render this thing right here is exact same with how we did it with the function components. We can just do this. Oh, by the way, I guess I want to show you guys a problem real quick. Clock class. If you do this right here, it's not gonna work because JSX needs something to wrap around the clock. Whenever you have like two components, they want something to wrap around it. Usually, you can just wrap them around with a div tag, but often in cases, let's say you accidentally gave all of the divs tag that you have a CSS attribute, then you actually render something with a div. So usually I'll just do React.fragment because that is just very neutral. So React.fragment, think of it just like a closing tag. It doesn't really do anything, but it passes that error right there. So yeah, if we see that that perfectly works, we can make this specified done with class, done with function, right? And then that's going to show up, right? Now, as we said earlier, in the function we accepted the props. Now let's let the class accept the prop too. Here's how we do it. We do the same thing here. And instead of doing new date, now we can get access to it. But how do we get access to this attribute called pass data? What we do is we do this dot props dot pass data, pass date, and it should work perfectly. Yep. And the underlying, I want to talk about the reason why real quick. The reason we have to use this is basically we have to refer to the clock class, which has access to all of these props, versus a function. You don't really call. You can just call whatever is accepted here. And now we kind of went over props, and we know that usually you usually you pass a prop in the when you're calling the component somewhere, so that you can later use that data, that props data that is passed uh, inside of the actual components to do something. Um, let's talk about the negatives of functions in class, maybe. So first of all, functions generally functions function a lot better than classes. So function perform a lot better than classes. I think I don't know how much it is better, but I think the React team say that they're going to make the speed increase by like 30% if you use function instead of classes later. The reason is that a class, whenever you do a class that extends a React component, it kind of has more heavy memory allocation and it checks for these life cycle methods, which we'll get into the next one. And clock class also, well, yeah, it has these life cycle methods, which life cycle methods are basically you just make them like this. One of the life cycle methods is component mount, which is saying that if the component uh, is finished calling for the first time, is finished rendering for the first time, then we call component mount. Um, but a function does not have access to these life cycle methods, and a life cycle method is really important. In a lot of cases. For example, when you go to a new page, what do you want your user to do, or what do you want to do in the back end, or what code you want to run? Then you might want to use a component did mount, versus functions do not have access to that. So when do we use functions? Generally speaking, if we're making a simple clock like this, never ever use a class, because the go-to rule is that if you only have a render function like this, just a render in a class, then it's far more better just to use function. Because usually when you use a class, there's going to be a lot of heavy stuff over here before the render. Versus functions generally just rendering something. So let me see what else should I talk about. Lifecycle methods, functions, class. Yeah, that's basically it. So remember the golden rule again, to use functions. I would even suggest to always try to make your components functional components first, and then see later if you need lifecycle methods, you might want to use a clock class. You might want to use a class. Oh, also one thing that I didn't go over is that in a class it is more usual to use to make something called state, which will hold information that will be later used in the rendering parts. And functions, you don't really do states with those. So yeah, that is one thing that I'll go over in the next part of the tutorial. So thank you for watching. Stay tuned.